Hello everyone, this is Dr. Silveira. Thank you for sending questions my way. I'm going to try to answer them. Let's go. So first question says, how does your body know what to do after being in a strenuous state? I'm going to combine this question with the next one, which is in a fairly similar topic. The second question says, what signals the body to make the changes to shift the homeostasis to cope with the physical strain that's being applied to the body? And well, part of the question reads, I would think it's the brain, but are there any other systems that contribute to it? So when we exercise, many of the body systems act together to coordinate the response. So these include not only the brain, but also the cardiovascular system. The heart pumps faster so that the blood can reach the muscles and the organs that need it to respond to the exercise. Your respiratory system also reacts. You saw in your activity that you were breathing faster and there were changes that happened to adapt to the exercise response. And also the nervous system acts in many ways by helping us contract the muscles and by helping the tone of the blood vessels to regulate how the blood is being pumped and delivered to the body. And finally, the endocrine system assists us in the response to exercise because it will release hormones that will help the heart pump faster, such as adrenaline. This is a hormone that is released in the adrenal gland. And also, it will release cortisol and glucagon, which are hormones that are going to help regulate the metabolism of sugars and make sure that your body has glucose available in the blood so that cells can metabolize it and convert it into ATP for energy. So all of this response is coordinated, and it happens as we start exercising. As we progress during exercise and we make it harder and harder, there are responses that are going to act accordingly. So then to respond to the first question, so what happens when we stop? So when we stop, our muscles stop contracting. We stop demanding that extra energy for the exercise effort. So then the body acts in a way that counter-arrests what was being activated. So one of the major players of this response is the vagus nerve, which is going to release acetylcholine that is going to slow down the heart. So by doing so, the heart starts pumping less, and then we start breathing slower, and everything returns to a normal state. It is said that when we train, so when we exercise regularly, we train this response in a way that it will happen faster as our body is more used to it. So in other words, let's say you want to run a marathon tomorrow, chances are you're going to get a lot of fatigue and your body's not going to be able to respond in a way that you will finish the race. Some of you may. But if you practice this stress of exercise and then return to normal state multiple times by training several months for the marathon, then your body will return to normal faster than it would if this is the first time you ever run. So keep your body exercising, and that way you will be able to adapt to the exercise response better, and then it will be more beneficial for your overall health. So there's another question that says, why do you think our body does not have a built-in function or one that we have accumulated to withstand the effects of smoking? So in other words, why can't the lungs filter the trash out? And the answer is that the lung certainly has mechanisms to remove trash out. Actually, it does it all the time. We have specific cells that are sentinels in our airways. Those are called phagocytes, or we call them alveolar macrophages. These cells have a specific function. They will sense anything that has a particular pattern or form. So they have receptors in their membrane that will detect if there's a bacteria, if there's a particle, and then the response is to do phagocytosis. In other words, it eats the particle or the pathogen, and then inside of the cell uses enzymes to destroy it. These cells can also release signals that will make other cells come to the lung of injury and release reactive oxidative species or do something called oxidative stress, which is also going to help fight an infection. The problem with smoking is that, first of all, there are too many toxins in it, and a lot of them will bypass this response because they will go directly to the blood. So it will get in the lung, and by the time a cell can sense something and get rid of it, it's already diffused into the blood and now it's affecting the rest of your body. The second problem is that there are some particles that come with the cigarette smoke that are too tiny, and these specialized cells cannot see them. So they will accumulate, and over the years they will form bigger accumulations that then will start blocking the airway and making you have problems breathing. And then the third one is that it's a gas, right? And it has particles, but sometimes it may trick the immune cells to believe that there is a pathogen. So then these immune cells will activate an immune response and they will start destroying, but what they're actually destroying is air. It's dirty air, but it's just air. So what happens is that by releasing these enzymes and by attacking what is supposed to be there but it's not, it ends up attacking itself. So then we get diseases such as emphysema, which is what happens when the lung starts being damaged. And the damage results from its own immune response of the lung thinking that there was a pathogen. So certainly the answer to the question is that there is a function, there is a built-in function to remove things, but there is not one specialized for cigarette smoke because of the ways that cigarette smoke acts that can bypass some of these and make it worse for our lungs. The next question says, how often do lungs heal? How can the lungs constantly work all the time and not get tired? Okay, so these are two questions in one. So lungs heal by cell division like any other organ. Not all cells can divide, when they're differentiated. We know that they can no longer do mitosis, but there are some investigators that have found stem cells in the lung telling us that there is a possibility that the lung can regenerate tissue that is being damaged. However, there's still a lot that we need to learn about this process and how the lung can replace cells that have been lost in response to injury or to disease. So we really don't know how. We know that there is a possibility, and we know that the immune cells, for example, they do get replaced because there's blood that is irrigating the lungs all the time, and then cells first are monocytes and then differentiate into macrophages, for example. And then to answer the question about how the lungs do not get tired, cells use energy like any other cells from glucose and oxygen and do not get tired as long as we keep feeding them glucose and oxygen. So keeping your cells healthy by eating healthy, by exercising, so by providing the nutrients that the cells need, as well as cofactors and vitamins that the enzymes to perform these metabolic functions require to function properly. Next question says, why did the pulse oximeter read the same exact number even after I exercise? Okay, so I don't know how much you read about the oximeter, but basically when you use the oximeter, you put a device in your finger that had a light. And this light, what it does is it checks the changes in color that happen to the hemoglobin in your blood when there are different amounts of oxygen bound to it. So in other words, if the hemoglobin is bound to more oxygen or to less oxygen, there's going to be a change in color, and this is going to be detected by the light in the oximeter. So the reason you could have read the same value could be due to several factors. First of all, depends on the color of your skin. The oximeter may not be good to pick it up. Some people, like me, have trouble sometimes with the reading because I do have very cold hands. So circulation in my hands is not very good, so it doesn't actually read it. Some people with darker skin, the change in color of hemoglobin is not visible in a skin that is too dark. And that depends on the device. So certainly it could be due to that, and we will call that a technical reason. But also, if your exercise did not result in a change in saturation of hemoglobin, which is what I would have expected, you probably wouldn't have seen a significant change anyway. So the body has a very smart way to keep your oxygen being delivered to your tissues. So the chances that there is a significant reduction in how much oxygen is bound to hemoglobin by exercising 2 minutes is very low. And it would indicate that there may be something external affecting it. That could be that you're not properly, that you have a problem with the hemoglobin itself, that there is a problem in the metabolism, or that you are in a high altitude. So I don't expect any of those happening in your classroom. Therefore, probably most of you had the same reading even after exercising for 2 minutes or whatever it is that you did. Okay, next question says, what actually happens when you get asthma? Why do your lungs stop working as well? Okay, so asthma is an obstructive disease. What does it mean? It means that it affects the flow of air from your nose to your lungs. And how does that happen? Well, it's not just one way. I study asthma and I see different types of asthma manifesting. Sometimes it's the muscle around the airways that contracts and makes the airways narrow. So now there's less space for air to flow, so you're having trouble breathing in and out. Also, it could be that by an allergic response or an activated immune response, the cells within your lungs start secreting a lot of mucus. So then you get an accumulation of mucus that is now blocking the passage of the air. So the lungs don't stop working, but what happens is that you have trouble getting the air through where it has to go through. And certainly it's something that can really affect your life, because if you cannot get air from the nose to the blood, then we're going to have problems metabolizing in any other tissue in our bodies. So it's really a problem, and it could be deadly. So the lungs don't certainly stop working, but there is an obstruction in the way that air passes through them. Next question says, why do hormones have an impact on why a female has asthma longer than a male? Okay, so we don't know the answer to that question yet, but I work every day in my lab to try to answer that question. So I can tell you what we know so far, which is that hormones, especially in women, they change every day. You know, there are some hormones that are going to be higher levels and others that are going to be lower levels, and that changes throughout the month. And these hormones have, some of these hormones, especially the steroid hormones such as estrogens and progesterone, what they do is when there's a receptor inside of a cell, they can bind to that receptor, and then they can go directly to the nucleus of that cell, and they can affect the expression of genes. If the expression of the genes that they're changing is a gene related to immunity or inflammation, what's going to happen is that if this is in a cell like those that I mentioned earlier that can get activated in asthma, now we can have more secretion of mucus, or we can have more activity of the smooth muscle around the airways. So then the hormone indirectly is affecting functions in the lung that are associated with asthma. So we have noticed that in certain individuals, when the estrogen levels are high, we actually see more expression of genes that are inflammatory, which is going to cause more inflammatory cells to be recruited to the lung and more inflammation and obstruction in the lung. Next question says, what age does asthma wear off in males? Okay, so you probably asked this question because you saw my video and you read about the sex differences in the incidence and the prevalence of asthma. So we know there are more women with asthma than men, and that there are more boys with asthma than girls. Not necessarily because a boy that had asthma as a kid will lose it as a result of puberty, but that can happen, and it happens in a lot of boys. And in the boys in which that happens, it usually coincides with puberty, which happens around age 12 to 14. We believe that there is another hormone called testosterone that has a very similar action than estrogen, but affects different genes. So we believe that testosterone is actually helping the immune system not be as activated in response to stimuli from the environment. So a boy with asthma then will stop responding to some allergens and will stop having an asthma attack. It is also possible that as we grow, our lungs change in shape, in size. Our body changes in shape, in size. We become bigger. Our thoracic cavity becomes bigger. Our lungs become bigger. So then all of these changes, also our muscles, testosterone affects the muscles. So all of these changes alone can have something to do with the fact that some males stop having asthma as they undergo puberty. But we really don't know why or exactly how this happens. So keep tuned in my research, and hopefully in a few years we will have some more answers to these questions. Next question is, why is it hard for us to breathe when we run or exercise? Okay, so when we run or exercise, we put our body in a state of stress. We're now going from a rest state in which everything functions peacefully to now our muscles need more blood because they need to perform more metabolism, they need more energy, they need to contract. So the heart starts pumping fast to deliver that blood to our muscles, and as a consequence, our heart rate goes high. You probably did this in the activity, right? So it's hard to breathe because the body is asking us to do that faster than we would normally do it, and also because all these stress signals are activated, so then we feel the stress and that makes it feel hard. And as I mentioned in the first question, if we practice, then our body gets used to this and recovers faster. So certainly it's hard for us to breathe when we exercise if it is the first time we do it, but if we are used to it, it will not feel as hard. Question 9, and then I have 2 more after this, is why do you use mice for research testing instead of alternative methods? So the answer to this question has to do with the type of work I do. So an alternative method to study asthma will be to isolate specific cells from lungs, which is not very easy. And then the other thing is that when I study a lung cell, think about the lung and how it is. Imagine that you're entering through a nose, and then you go through the trachea, and then you open in the bronchial tree, and then you encounter a lung cell in the alveoli. What would you see is a cell that in one side is seeing air, and in the other side is seeing liquid. So to mimic that environment is certainly possible in the lab using some artificial materials such as some gels. Sometimes we can have the cells living on top of gels and then they see air in one side and then they see liquid in the other side. But we haven't been able to do an artificial lung that will mimic everything that is going on at that time. So that is forcing us to use an animal model to understand what's going on. And especially in my field, in which we're studying the effects of hormones, because as I mentioned, the levels of hormones change all the time. So sometimes we have to modify the hormone levels in the mouse. We have to do surgeries in the mouse to remove the ovaries so that there's no more estrogen being produced. We have to feed the animals with hormones so they can metabolize it, and we can see how much actually goes in the lung instead of culturing a cell and adding estrogen to it directly. So not until we have a fully functional lung that we can reproduce in the lab, we have to use animal models to mimic the disease and to learn from it so that we can help people that suffer from these diseases to have better lives. Two more questions. So question number 10 says, how do you know if an adult man and young woman have asthma? I guess the question is, how do you diagnose asthma, if I understood it properly? So asthma is diagnosed by going to the doctor and performing a series of tests. So the first symptom a person with asthma will have is they will start coughing, right? Coughing for no reason, having trouble breathing, having trouble taking a deep breath, because remember, there is something obstructing the passage of air. So what the doctor does is something similar to what you did in your activity, which is to make the patient blow and measure the flow, or the peak expiratory flow. So by measuring flow and comparing to a chart that has the normal values for certain gender and gender and age, then we can actually know whether there is an obstruction or not. But to really, really diagnose asthma, we have to do some more detailed analysis. So basically what we have to do is something called a spirometry, in which we will take the patient to the laboratory and then we will measure the different volumes of the lung, which you probably learned in class. So by calculating how fast or how much air we can blow through a tube in a small period of time, and how much air can we totally blow until we don't feel that we don't have any more, we do a ratio of these two values. One is called the FEV1 and the other one is called the FBC. And by doing the ratio, if that ratio is lower than 1 or lower than what it should be for your age and sex, then we can diagnose you with asthma. And then there are other methods in which we can actually trigger the lung to constrict and then see how fast it will open up. That is called the methacolic challenge. And we actually do that in our mice to diagnose asthma with them. So I guess it goes step by step as we start seeing symptoms of asthma. And then we use different drugs to help the patient breathe. So for example, if you just show up with some coughing and trouble breathing, the first thing we're going to give you is something that is going to help you open up the airways. And a lot of you have seen this. This is called albuterol sulfate. So this is an inhaler, and basically the patient will be asked to take this medication as needed to help breathe. But you can't use this all the time because it can have some damaging effects. So if the person is using it more than 3 times a week or more than 3 times a day, there are charts that will tell the doctor to maybe go for something more sophisticated or more stronger. So for example, I have here an example of fluticasone. So this one, what it's going to do is is similar way of using it, but what it's going to do is it's going to stop the immune cells from having excessive responses. And you can tell that this is also something that we don't want to be doing all the time, right? So the goal for us in the lab is to actually understand what is actually causing the asthma so that we can stop that in a way that will not affect the rest of the functions of the body. So I guess I went through a branch, but yeah, but basically the diagnosis is done in the pulmonary function lab or in the doctor's office just by looking at the airflow. Okay, the last question says, what if the body is low in iron? How can someone measure the body properly? As in measurements we took in class. Okay, so iron is a metal that is important for hemoglobin function. Actually, it's important to make hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is a protein that we have in the blood, the red blood cells. You probably saw the structure. It has iron in it, and this iron helps hemoglobin change the structure when it's bound to oxygen so that it's more properly bound, and it not only helps in the binding, but it also in the release. So your body needs to be able to catch the oxygen when we breathe and also to release it when it reaches the tissues. So if your body is low in iron, it's probably low in hemoglobin, or your hemoglobin does not work properly. So how is this going to affect the measurements that we do in the lab? So, well, for example, if we are running, remember what's happening. We start pumping blood faster because we need more oxygen in our muscles. Now, if the hemoglobin we're pumping is not as efficient, what's going to happen is that we're going to have to pump more. So if you compare a person with high iron versus a person with low iron, and you check their heart rate, the person with the lower iron is going to pump the heart faster because it's going to need more blood to replenish the oxygen that is being demanded by the muscle. This is going to result also in higher respiratory rate and more fatigue for the person. So if you are anemic and you're low in iron, or you're not properly, you don't have good nutrition, you don't eat enough iron, what's going to happen is you're going to get more tired when you exercise because your body's going to have to do more effort to feed oxygen to your muscles to be able to perform this exercise. Okay, so those were all the questions that were sent to me. I hope I was clear, and I hope you now understand a little bit better how our body responds to exercise, and hopefully you understand a little bit more about how our lungs work and what happens during asthma. And thank you so much for listening to me, and if you have any more questions, I'm happy to answer them. Have a good day.